You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Welcome back to the official Deaf Crocodile podcast. My name is Ryan Verrill, and on this special episode, we are bringing another audio commentary for you, and this is for the second Deaf Crocodile official Blu-ray release, and that is for the wonderful animated film Delta Space Mission. This is from 1984, and our audio commentary is here from Kat Ellinger, author, film critic, and editor-in-chief for Diabolique magazine, and more. Have a good listen, and we'll see you on the next one.
Hello and welcome. My name's Kat Ellinger. I'm an author, editor, and critic, and this is the trip-tastic Delta Space Mission from 1984. This is about as obscure as you can get for a restoration. It was part of a Romanian animated TV series, which I believe originally aired in 1983, or at least the initial series aired in 1983. And this last section, co-directed by Kalin Kazan and Mirka Toya, was extended into a full-length feature. The original series comprised of 13 8-minute episodes, and there's a reason for this, but what makes this especially special, the most special of the special, is this counts as possibly one of the first animated sci-fi features from Romania. Like I said, it wasn't conceived as such, it was conceived as this TV series, and therefore the team behind it and the directors worked on it as such, worked on it in sections, and there again was a production reason for that. And so I think when you know that, it helps make sense of the narrative, because even though there is this overriding story, a very, very interesting story that's derived not just from science fiction, but also Gothic and fairy tales. And there's so much to say about that. It does feel like it takes place over a series of vignettes, and that's because it does. There's something slightly fractured about the overall narrative construction. But then if you see how and why this was put together, it totally makes sense why the narrative doesn't have a complete flow. You do have this overriding arc of Alma, the space journalist, and the supercomputer in this obsession that takes place around Alma from the sentient computer. So much to say about that. But then you have these little escapades, like you have the little robot called Tin who goes off on his own adventures. He almost has like a mythic hero's quest arc all of his own. You have the Delta Space Mission crew as well, and their aims, which feels very Star Trek in a way. It's very naive, very utopian, derived from one of these stories of humans going into space and wanting to unite all creeds and cultures and planetary species in an almost hippie way, although this comes with, I guess, that all-important, although it's not too damning, that all-important Eastern European existential angle, which I adore. I absolutely adore. One thing that's always fascinated me, and I've never really found any sort of solid explanation for this, I guess it's just the way our cultures have developed, but in Eastern Europe, especially in countries that come from the Soviet bloc, or countries that were occupied by the Soviet Union and under Soviet Union control in the post-war period, tend to have a much more adult, for want of a better word, approach to animated film that we don't tend to see in the West. It's an exception in the West. We see the same thing in Japan, which again is Eastern, in that Japanese film culture encompasses all sorts of animation, full-length animation, some quite adult, quite violent, and if we see how that then went into TV with anime series, it's not all about making content for kids. If we look at places like Czechoslovakia for a start, and Russia, and I'll be talking about this, the Soviet Union have their own long-running, very rich history with animated film that, again, isn't all about making films for kids. But if we look at Czechoslovakia, for example, talents like Jan Svankmajer, I'm thinking of people that have really made an impact in the West. Probably Jan Svankmajer would be the biggest of those. Or if we look at someone like Poland, and we have filmmakers like Valerian Borowczak, who came out of animated film, really inspired Westerners like Terry Gilliam. And Terry Gilliam actually is one of the few Westerners who embraced animation as a more of a quote-unquote art medium and something that wasn't just for kids. Now, Delta Space Mission is slightly different because it does embrace a lot of Western influence, especially Hanna-Barbera and the Disney model. And I'll look at some of the concepts of Disney that have been animation concepts that have been brought into this, because Kazan especially said in interviews, this is how he approached the story with this, using the Disney 12 points of animation, which is about striking that balance between realism and then a heightened experience to make it more whimsical. But it wasn't just influenced by Disney. He was also influenced by, talking of Russia, a very famous Russian animator by the name of Lev Atamanov, and you can definitely see the influence in Alma's sort of whimsical dancing thing when she sees the sparkly orb, and this is definitely a high point for the film. There's a similarity here, maybe not in the specific animation style, which goes for this very late 70s psychedelic kind of, I grew up in the 70s, I was a little kid, and a lot of animation strayed into this very, very trippy style, even the stuff for kids. But just the whimsical energy and also the focus on dance-like movements, can definitely see an influence of Atanamov's Ballerina on a Boat, which was an animated short from 1969. So we're East and West influences going into Delta Space Mission. But it is, to all intents and purposes, a kids' film, much like Disney made kids' films. So slightly different. And there are a few differences in this that I want to go through when it comes to Romania being part of the Soviet Union at the time, being under that communist rule, but also being one of the states that were under that oppressive system that had far more freedom. If you look at somewhere like Czechoslovakia for a start, again, I specialise in Czechoslovakian cinema, so it's why I refer to it so much. But after the Prague Spring in 1968, there was like a brief period of permissiveness where you saw the Czech New Wave. And after 1968, when the Russian tanks stormed into Prague, everything was shut down, everything was put on state control. Same goes for Poland. If you look at another filmmaker that's quite well known in cult circles in the West, Andrzej Żuławski famously had his own science fiction epic on the Silver Globe, which he was making in the 70s, and spent so many months out in Mongolia filming this, and the state just shut it down. They thought it was too dangerous, and so the film was never finished and was only quote unquote completed in the 80s. Romania didn't seem to have that problem, and therefore you do see some very stark differences in this compared to a lot of the other stuff that was coming out of the Eastern European countries that were controlled by Soviet rule from the same period. We often think of Russian animation as being entirely separate from Western animation, and is the post-war stuff and the Cold War stuff certainly is, and there was so much experimentation going on there, so much experimentation, it was incredible, and this direct move away from the Disney model. But that wasn't always so. When Russian animators started out very early on in the like classic Hollywood period, they were emulating Disney. It's only when the Cold War years came in and there was this absolute hatred for the West and America specifically, that there was a direct move away from the Disney style to make something more. Although that said, even when working within the Disney style, the Russian interpretations of fairy tales are a lot darker, in line with the sort of cultural milieu, if you want to call it that. A lot darker, a lot more folk based, like folk horror even in some cases. So different. But Kazan said in his interview he grew up watching things like Hanna-Barbera, which is obviously a TV show. You wouldn't have seen that in Poland or Czechoslovakia or the USSR in that time, but you could see it in Romania. And Disney did have a big impact on his work. And as a young animator, it was his dream to leave his home and go to America and work for Disney. And in the end, after the Velvet Revolution, after the Berlin Wall came down, and at the end of communism, he did move to America, but interestingly went into video games. And I say interestingly because you see so many aspects, especially in the sort of spaceship design and stuff, retro futuristic style, that you would perhaps link to the video game world now. And so it's a nice little precursor to that. So this did come out of an animated TV series. It was created by Victor Antonescu. And there were a number of directors associated with the series, one of them Antonescu himself, although he only did 5 episodes. This is the only episode that you can see translated. You can find many of the others online in sort of ropey quality, which gives us more of an appreciation for the work done in restoration on Delta Space Mission. But you can see them, and you can see the tone and the style is very different from episode to episode, because you've got so much of a different creative minds behind them. The idea for the initial series was to have like a sea world, to have everything under the sea, but then that moved up to space. And with space comes so many different possibilities. And I really love the angle, this very almost like tragic, classic, romantic style that they've chosen for this one, which is just very strange for science fiction. Although there is that influence from 2001 Space Odyssey, but I would say, you know, you've got the sentient AI, you've got this question, what if machines started to think for themselves? What if machines became corrupt, ... You've got that whole line in it. But that is where the similarity to Kubrick's work ends, because this then takes a totally different trajectory, and really in keeping with, I think, Eastern European fantasy especially, this does focus on aspects of fairy tale, which I absolutely adore. I think the Eastern Europeans, their interpretation, talking of the Disney model, the Eastern European interpretations of the fairy tale that you can find on film, especially from that post-war to 90s period, they're so dark and so wonderful. And so even though this is childish and it has a lot of elements of whimsy in it as well, when you look at that core story, this obsession that this computer develops, there's something in there that's quite perverse when you start digging around into the bones of the story, even though it's not explicit. Before I go into all these themes and concepts and also break down some of the animation style that they use, because there's some interesting stuff in the character of Alma specifically when it comes to sexuality. And I know Deaf Crocodile have used heavy metal as in their description of this film as one of the kind of cosmic twins to this, and you definitely see that very audacious, almost like heavy metal in the character of Alma, very sexualized style to her, which again is kind of against the grain in Eastern European animated film. But I wanted to talk about anima films because they have a really interesting history. I mentioned that the Soviet Union and Russia had a long history with animation, and they started not too long after the Disney model came on the scene. There was a real interest in animation in Eastern Europe overall. And I love the fact that you could go to university there, like people like Jan Svankmajer and Juraj Hertz, who didn't go into animated film, he actually went into film. But they went and studied puppetry at university, and you could go and study animation or puppetry in with fine arts, and it was considered very, very serious because this is serious business. This took a year to make in these little segments, having to work within this very strict regime as well, to do with ratios and rotas and who could work on what at what time, because everything was controlled by the state and state funding. So there were a lot of additional pressures. And I think when you just look at just the painstaking nature of classic animation as well, this is so detailed and so beautiful. There's so much work that went into it by hand. I think it gives you a real appreciation for this as an art. But like I said, in the West, we don't tend to take animation seriously, and we write it off as something that is for children. Whereas I think if we look to world cinema, to Japan, to Asia, to Eastern Europe, we can see there are so many other possibilities in there that we really haven't explored nearly enough in the West. And that's why, because a lot of these features still remain quite obscure. It's incredible when they surface to restoration. A lot of them have been slow to move into that direction, though. So I see this restoration is kind of a breakthrough. It's a big moment for Eastern European cinema. We hardly hear anything about Russian cinema outside of big names like Tarkovsky. And we're only just starting to see some of the Polish and Czechoslovakian stuff coming to Blu-ray. So this really is like as niche as it gets, as obscure as it gets, but also quite wonderful. Anima Film, now, they were based in Bucharest. They came out of Bufdia Cinema Centre, which was specialised in long and short reel films. And they started off as a dedicated animation and puppetry unit. And again, this goes back to what I was saying, is this dedicated animation and like there's a state investment in this stuff. Romania is late to the party on this, though. They come along in the post-war period and start focusing on animation, whereas in Russia, they're doing this 10, 20, 30 years before. And so they're slower to come to the animation pool. But in 1964, Anima Films is founded as this unit splinters off from Bufdia Cinema Centre and becomes its own concern. And to start off, it gets like about 15 short films a year, but by the 70s, that's increased to 60, 70. So that's a lot of short films, and it's specifically short films, which is why we get this strange structure in this. So they have like a rota of so many films per year, a ratio of so many films per year. There are limits on length, and it generally specializes in things like comedy, children's films, and fantasy as well. So this is really in keeping with the anima model of the time. In the 60s and 70s, they were the only studio in Romania that was specializing in this stuff. And there was a lot of demand for it as well. So, you know, it was bread and butter for the studio. But as Gianalberto Benedazzi says in her book, Animation, A World History, she said in the 80s, anima really started to open up to different approaches to animation. And I talked about the adult approach to animation. Anima prior to this had been hesitant, or not hesitant, but just not open to that. They'd made kind of childish shorts and things like that, things that were considered quite conventional for the time, although not conventional when Westerners see them, because Eastern convention is so different. But they stuck to the convention thing, and they'd resisted this model of the quote-unquote art house animator, which we'd seen in places like Poland, we'd seen in places like Czechoslovakia, where stop motion, puppetry, animation were being used as a quote-unquote serious art film realm, and they had been resistant to that model. But as the aforementioned book points out, in the 80s, anima start to become more open to that idea. And so they start to bring in different new talent, and they start to experiment or move away from their more conventional model. And it's this opening up, this freedom, I think, that brings them to the natural conclusion of making their very first full-length feature, which is a first for Romania. Even if it wasn't initially conceived that way, it just becomes that organically. And when they were working on this, they weren't working on this with the idea of, we're going to make a full-length feature. This is a serial. And I think you can tell that. But the limitations were there. So there was nothing they could do about that. They were basically given their assignments. Although I believe Kazan said that they won their spot. He and Mircea sort of won their spot on this show as part of a competition. There was a competitive element to that. There was something to do with the soundtrack that I want to discuss a little bit later on as well, that you had two different soundtracks to this. So Antonescu founded this. He comes up with the idea, but there was no sort of communication between the different groups. And so if you look at the episodes, they're all tonally very different, all set in the 31st century around this Delta space mission, though, which is kind of got the Star Trek thing going on. So some of the other episodes featured things like this young couple and their robot, and they go under the ocean, where the kind of microscopic is become giant. And there's a dinosaur one as well with volcanoes. And there's an ice world one. There's a time machine one. There's teleporting. So some very sort of conventional science fiction topics covered. Whereas this one was based on, or partly based, or partly inspired. So partly inspired by 2001 and the concept of HAL, this idea of a computer becoming sentient. But I think more interesting, I think we always point to 2001, and that's been discussed to death in terms of science fiction. But also this was based on a late 19th century romantic poem called The Morning Star or The Evening Star, which is a really beautiful Gothic piece of poetry, which has wonderful elements of traditional fairy tale in it. And that is where I think you can see much more of that in Delta Space Mission than you can perhaps 2001. Maybe just the core concept of the computer, But outside of that, I see a lot more influence from this Gothic tradition. I see a lot more influence from the fairy tale tradition. To talk in fairy tale tradition more broadly before I discuss the Morning Star and how it relates to Delta Space Mission, you have the theme of obsession and danger and maidens in peril that runs all the way through fairy tales. These princesses that are captured by the evil lord or the evil king or the troll. And Alma really is that character type, although she is a modern version of that character type. She isn't the quivering maiden, and this is what I love about her. She's a kick-ass girl. She flies around the galaxy. She is an ace journalist. She can use a laser gun, even though everybody is out, all the guys are kind of, I didn't mention it, but in that initial scene, they're all kind of, it's like that wonderful scene in Superman where you got Pamela Stevenson and everyone's kind of ogling her and being distracted in Superman. It's got a similar vibe to that. And again, this is children's entertainment, but they don't seem to mind. So it has that. Alma is a very, very she's a very sexualized being. And so strong is the sexual energy, I suppose, or allure, that it awakens this supercomputer. It awakens his lust or whatever it is, his obsession with her. He's mainly obsessed with the concepts of love. So you have that in it, and I think that is very traditional fairy tale, the capturing of the love object. And the Morning Star is slightly different, actually. It doesn't really fall into that. But you also have aspects of Beauty and the Beast as well. This idea of a beast being attracted to a maiden, and then that maiden being able to teach and ultimately teach them something about life, although it doesn't get the happily ever after that Beauty and the Beast does. But there's a lot of sort of interspecies romance in the fairy tale. So a lot of beings that aren't entirely human coming together with mortal women, and it's a recurring theme. And you have it in this just in a more modern or even postmodern way, in that it's a machine that has the muse of the young woman, that has that obsession. It's not a troll. It's not a prince that's been turned into a frog. It's not the beast of Beauty and the Beast, which again is a mortal that's been turned into a beast, and only the love of a woman will save him. It's not that, but it does have that interspecies sort of crossover. And Alma herself isn't human. She is alien. She is an alien being. And so it's really interesting that even though this is a science fiction film, it is essentially a fairy tale, just a fairy tale set in space. So the specific fairy tale poem that this is based on, as I said, The Morning Star, it has several English translations in the title. So The Morning Star, The Evening Star, The Vesper, The Day Star, or my particular favourite, Lucifer. In its original Romanian language, it's Luciferul. And basically, this is an epic piece of romantic poetry with some of the same cynicism that we saw at the Fin de siècle in Europe, some of that same sort of cynicism, lots of philosophy embedded in it. It was written by the author Mihai Emescu. This was published in 1883, but it took him, in all the great poets, a good 10 years to write, and it was part of a series of poems. And after this, the author succumbed to mental illness. But it really is a fascinating poem that draws on very traditional fairy tale, Romanian folklore, and at the center of it, so the Lucifer reference, you have this being, a celestial being called Hyperion, who is a star. And this princess Catalina, every night she looks out of the window and she calls to this star, and as she sleeps, she calls to him. It's like a seduction. And so this star, he comes down while she sleeps and he explores her. And this is packed full of sexual energy and sexual tension. There are scenes in it, if we talk about it in a cinematic sense, that evoke scenes in Gothic horror, like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, with this presence, this sleepwalker coming into a young maiden's room at night. But Catalina is not innocent in the slightest. She is the one calling to this Hyperion. She is the one that gets his attention. She calls to him and he falls in love with her. And after several visits, he falls in love with her. And she continues this sort of, well, it's like a prick tease, really. She continues. But she refers to him as Lucifer. And it's an interesting reference because, again, in that romantic tradition, it goes back to things like Milton's Paradise Lost. And the idea of Lucifer being a fallen angel, majestic in ruin. Although Hyperion isn't really ruined. Outside of not being human, he doesn't really have any of those other aspects, even though she calls him Lucifer. And the poem starts with, "From 'neath the castle's dark retreat, her silent way she wended, each evening to the window seat where Lucifer attended, and secretly with never fail she watched his gracious pace, where vessels drew their pathless trail across the ocean's face." There is so much libidinal energy that flows through this as she calls to this spirit. But when she sees him, when he appears to her in different carnations. And one of them is he comes to Earth and he looks like a beautiful boy, but he's lifeless. There's something about him that's like a corpse. And she finds it off-putting. He says, "Come to my castle and I'll make you immortal." And she's just like, "No, I don't want to do that." And so he goes off to the universe and he asks to be turned into immortal. And it's like a spin on The Little Mermaid, but here you have like a male, or I guess it's like it's like a supernatural being. So I don't really know if you could say that was gendered, but it's written in this very heteronormative way. So I would assume so. But it's like, I want to be turned into a human so that I can walk the earth. And whilst he's away, his request is turned down, and the universe basically says to him, "Look, human life is nothing. There's nothing to it. Love is nothing. You know, this is a futile quest, and you're going to find out why, but I'm not going to grant you your wish." And so when he comes back and he looks back on Catalina, she's gone off with some other guy. And so he's just left, Hyperion is left as this star to look down on the humans together doing their happily ever after. It's an incredible story, and we can see aspects of it registered in Delta Space Mission. Although the computer here, the super brain, is much more sinister in connotation, and Alma is much more pure of heart. She sees a beauty in him, and so this mutual attraction develops, but that's as far as it goes. We don't see any of the libidinal energy. That dance, actually, though, is quite provocative. It's quite sexual in a way, but outside of that, we don't really see very much of that. But the seeds of Morning Star are in this, and I absolutely adore that aspect. I think it's a wonderful thing. The poem is really, really popular, and it's considered one of the classics in Romania, but outside of, again, Eastern Europe, it's not very well known. When we talk about the Disney version of the fairy tale, we often think of the fairy tale as this sexless, childish thing. And yet, when we look at those more traditional fairy tales and the folklore, we see that's not the case. They are far darker. They are chocked full of sexual perversion, and a lot of them take the form of morality tales to warn young women away from, like if you look at Little Red Riding Hood, never stray from the path lest you meet the wolf. And of course, famously, Angela Carter, when she rewrote these traditional fairy tales in 1978 as The Bloody Chamber. She gave them feminist revisionist meanings, and so Little Red Riding Hood becomes the wolf. So you do have all of that sex in there that was kind of watered down by the Disney model. So it's interesting, given how obviously inspired by Disney this was in certain respects, especially in the characters, that it still has that underlying sense of classic folklore, classic fairy tale tradition, in that there is a sexual element with this obsession of the computer and Alma, and this clear link to Morning Star, which is about a seduction. It's about falling in love. It's about the fickleness of the human heart and how short and futile the human experience is. And so much more cynical. I think Delta Space Mission has much more uplifting, life-affirming messages to it. You also have this, I want to talk about Tin, because Tin is the obvious Disney character. Disney made their brand by giving us cute animals, from Mickey Mouse to all of the classic feature-length films they have. Usually, if we look at something modern, say like Frozen, where I believe you got the talking snowman in that, but there's always a non-human sidekick as the central protagonist's helper. And in this case, it's Tin. So that's taken, I think, directly from the Disney model. And that's something that you wouldn't see in Polish or Czechoslovak or Russian animation from the same period. So you can definitely see that Western influence come in. Kazan said that he drew heavily on Disney's 12 principles of animation. And these are really I talked about how we don't take animation seriously in the West. But the process of animation, there is definitely more money thrown into it in a commercial sense. And the process of animation was kind of formulated by Disney. So you have these 12 points, and this was something that Kazan spoke about in his interview. It was something that was important to him. Squash and stretch, one of the principles where you give a character gravity by making them flexible and using volume. You see a lot, even though he's not on the screen at the moment, you see a lot of that used in the character of Tin, especially when he's thrown around by those wonderful little creatures. And this is one of Kazan's favourite scenes. I think it's one of mine as well. The weird plants in the background remind me of, again, Eastern animation, but Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind, which was 1984, so the same year as this. Hayao Miyazaki's wonderful early feature, which was based on his own 1982 manga. But in that, it's kind of a post-apocalypse thing where, again, you have like a strong female protagonist, lives in this post-apocalyptic world where humans can't breathe the air anymore, which becomes even more especially resonant in the time of COVID because they all have to go out masked up. But in terms of, even though this doesn't have the ecological themes of Miyazaki, some of that background design, I'm not saying that they were an influence on one another. I'm not sure if the makers here saw Miyazaki's manga, but just the kind of wild landscapes and the way that the vines and everything are rendered, this background, very, very similar to Nausicaa. I also see a similarity in this, in that Alma really being the central protagonist, although we've split off into Tin's section now, and we're seeing a lot of that squash and stretch technique used in Tin as he moves around this landscape. I mean, essentially, he's a very simple drawing of this little strange creature, but he is given so much life in the way that he's rendered, and also his characters, his expressions, his eating metal, but also his hero's arc as well. He has the arc of the hero and becomes the hero. So very Disney in that respect. But to go back to Miyazaki's films, you know, quite often feature these very strong female protagonists. So because of the serialized issues with the narrative in this, we don't see as much as Alma, I think, as we could do. But yet she still is the protagonist, the hero at the center of everything. And she's like, she reminds me of Emmanuel, you know, in the Italian rip-offs, especially the ones that Joe D'Amato did, although those are something else in terms of content, talking of perversion. But this idea of this super journalist who travels around, you know, she has like aspects of that. The Miyazaki films, though, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, Nausicaa, Princess Mononoke, like all of these films have these very strong female characters in them. And of course, the later Disney ones do as well. This idea of the hero being like a female entity. I absolutely adore this scene. I think it's so different tonally. You know, we're in the middle of a war, basically, but then we're thrown into something that you would see in Disney with the little monster being thrown around, so the little creature being thrown around. And these monsters, these creatures or whatever they are, being deliberately cute. I think this brings us to another one of the aspects of Disney where it was really all about outside of the more technical things. So Disney, even though a lot of their animation style was very simplified, and we see it in this, almost childish, there's a lot of realism in movement. So Disney paid particular attention to what they called staging. For example, they paid a lot of attention to very realistic movements. They paid a lot of attention to timing, to moving, to just general physics, physical roles. And if you look at their 12 points, a lot of them are to do with how things move. And you look at some of the more out there Eastern European animation, the montage, the two-dimensional stuff, you know, that it doesn't go for realism at all. Whereas something based on the Disney model, and this is true of the very early Soviet stuff as well, and of course that did have influence on this as well. But it's all about timing and physics, and a lot of those 12 points are about, you know, how creatures and people inhabit these worlds. They have to look realistic in the way they move. And this thing is very, very specific. And so this does have a sense of realism about it. But then another one of the points is exaggeration. So you take that as the core and you build this exaggerated world around it, as long as the characters look realistic when they move, look solid, look three-dimensional, look as if they move in a natural way. And so there is so much, I think so much of this applied to Delta Space Mission in the way that the animation is rendered. Kazan studied architecture. He came from a background in architecture. And I think you can see that in some of the really rich designs in the spacecraft. I think he was also responsible for Alma, actually. But then you also then had Toya, who came from a more cinematic background. So he understood like the storyboarding, the flow and things like that, and being able to make this more cinematic. I think if you look at the more experimental Eastern European animation, it's not cinematic. It's something else. It becomes like a different art form in and of itself. And so it doesn't have that, I guess, that sense of commercial appeal. And talking of appeal, one of Disney's last 12 points is appeal, in that they need to appeal. They need to have personality. They need to have character development. And we see that in Tin. We see that in Tin, actually. There seems to be more attention paid to Tin. Or I don't know if he just stands out more because of his cuteness, but more attention paid to Tin than actually Alma. We see a character develop at the start. We're told who she is. She's this great journalist. She doesn't take any messing. She's adventurous. She's strong. We see her in combat. and we see her interact with the super brain. But Tin has so much appeal as a character, even though he has no dialogue at all. And it is wonderful the way that we see that brought out in this particular scene. Before that, he follows Alma around and he eats things, and he's cute when he appears. But beyond that, there isn't much to him. But when he starts to interact with these creatures and he becomes in peril, he starts to form this very strong personality, and you really start to root for him. And I think he is incredible. There are darker aspects to this film, of course, but then Disney could get very, very dark. I remember seeing The Fox and the Hounds when I was a kid, and it absolutely gutted me. Bambi, Dumbo, you know, they didn't, I say the Disney model sort of, it removed more of the sexual perversity of early fairy tales, but there were these other big world themes about life and death and the meaning of life, especially in the more classic stuff. But there was also that cuteness to offset those darker themes that made them, I guess, more palatable or more appealing to young people. But like Nausicaä, I think you really can see that 70s counterculture, that very psychedelic style coming in that wouldn't have appeared in a Disney film. You know, so I think in terms of that, Delta Space Mission is a wonderful hybrid. It's a wonderful hybrid of all of these things. This creature here, to go back to Nausicaä, is very similar again to the creatures that you see in that film and in the manga, in that Nausicaä inhabits this post-apocalyptic world where these strange, like almost large wood lice, or I'm not sure what they are. They look like that weird sea creature that they found a few years ago that looks almost robotic but is a real life thing. They kind of look like that. And this is very similar. They're horrifying, almost as something out of Lovecraft, going to this awful landscape, this planet with these really strange creatures. There is a Lovecraftian aspect to this. And the creatures in this, you've got the cute creatures, but then you've got those very sinister creatures. And Nausicaä is very similar, and I see a lot of parallels between those two films, I guess in an artistic sense, maybe not in a narrative sense, because they come from two different places. We're still with Tim. He gets his big sort of hero's quest. He becomes the hero by the end, and we want him to become the hero because he is just wonderful. He is just such a wonderful, wonderful creation, and he's just utterly joyous to look at. I think, like the Disney films, it kind of lessens the tension as well and makes sure that things don't get too scary. You know, it gives you a feeling like it's okay, everything's all right. And meanwhile, Alma is still having to battle it out. We're back with her now in another episode. And she's just been fighting it out. We assume she might have been captured. But I want to talk about Alma and talk about the elements of Gothic, because this does have a kind of Gothic storyline in it as well. We usually think like Gothic and science fiction are these two separate things, when really they aren't. Because when we think of the true master, the grandmother of all science fiction, it's arguably Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is also one of the greatest Gothic novellas of all time. Very different in literary form to what it would become in cinema. When we started to see Frankenstein emerge as a cinematic concept, it became focused on the monster, and then later in Hammer on the Doctor himself as this like evil entity. But Mary Shelley's original novel is more or less like an existential ballad on whether man should have the right or the ability or the genius to play God. And if you look at the subheading, it's Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. This idea of a man who tries to become God and it backfires. And so that really is Gothic and science fiction together. And I think you can see so much of Frankenstein in so much of science fiction, even in something like 2001 Space Odyssey, the idea of how the supercomputer that is created but then becomes his own being and starts to have his own ideas. This is straight out of Shelley's text, and we also see it here in the concept of the superbrain. So it is, I guess, maybe not directly, but it is asking that question: should man have the right to play God and create another species, in this case, not bringing life back from the dead, but creating this supercomputer? Supercomputers running amok are all over science fiction. This fear that we have, what if technology overcomes us? This almost Nietzschean Superman, modern technology supersedes humanity. And we really see that in its most concentrated form in something like the Terminator franchise and Skynet, where machines have completely taken over the world. It's not this fear of an alien environment, although a Delta space mission has both. It combines both of those things. It combines the old school space explorations and finding things there that aren't particularly friendly, these more adventure landscape. The science fiction in that mold really is a progression of the adventure genre that was very, very popular in classic Hollywood. This idea of going out to the jungles and meeting natives and plant life and animals that were hostile. So it's a succession of that. And it takes those aspects. You have those aspects of real traditional adventure in this, albeit with a feminine hero at the centre of it all, and a non-human hero, and these wonderful, wonderful creatures. But then you also have these aspects of Frankenstein that ask broader, deeper questions about technology and man's place in that. So here it is that we have man creating a computer that's a genius, that it becomes almost like a celestial being, like Hyperion from the Morning Star. It gets its own ideas, and it also has the similar existential ideas that we have in Shelley's Frankenstein, in that in Frankenstein, the doctor creates this creature, and he sees his creature and he's repulsed by it and he runs away and he leaves it. So he abandons his child to make its own way in the world. This is slightly different. Here they want the child to do their bidding and it rebels. But this thing, it has a mind of its own, just like Frankenstein's creature has a mind of its own. And when he starts to roam around and interact with other humans, he starts to realize that he's lonely, that he needs love, that he needs company. And because he feels rejected, he becomes more and more monstrous because of it. Frankenstein's creature in Shelley's novel isn't actually like the corpse-like monster that we'd see in the films of Universal or Hammer. It's a slightly different being, but the monstrosity comes from an anger, from a form of rebellion, from feeling rejected. And so the creature, the center of it all, is like, I'm not having this, he starts to wreak havoc. And we see the same thing in Delta Space Mission, in that this is essentially Frankenstein's creature run amok. Again, he decides that he wants Alma. He shuts everybody out. He shuts out his masters. He frees himself. And he decides that he wants Alma for himself. And he is able to manipulate and utilize the technology that's been built around him and within him to get his own way. So it has those same really interesting themes that you find in a novel like Frankenstein. Although Frankenstein it really did influence and continues to influence far more than it's given credit for. We often think of Frankenstein as being more associated with the horror genre, and yet the Frankenstein line, this idea of man becoming God, is all over science fiction, and yet it's rarely acknowledged where it comes from. It comes from the Gothic. in terms of the Gothic and also the fairy tale, a Delta Space mission has a lot of those similar themes. So it has almost like what they call a Bluebeard framework, in this computer that falls in love with Alma is aggressive, he's dangerous, and he pursues her aggressively in a dangerous way. And he's quite happy to just kill off an entire city to get his hands on her. So there is this element of sexual threat. Who knows what he's going to do with her when he gets her? He's very interested in the concept of love and beauty, these human concepts, which he ultimately can't understand. He can never be human. So, again, it's this existential ballad on the nature of humanity and what makes us human. This one, slightly more positive, though, than Frankenstein, again, like with The Morning Star, in that it favours humanity as pure, and the purity and depth of the human heart being everything by the end. That genius is no match for the human heart, that the human heart can ultimately supersede genius. So it has, I think, much more uplifting messages than something like Frankenstein, which really is bleak in so many ways. But it owes a debt to Frankenstein, and it owes a debt to the Gothic, most certainly. And Alma is in that kind of Bluebeard framework, which I find really fascinating. Not seen a lot of that really in science fiction at all. So it's fascinating that it comes up in something like this. I want to move away quickly and just talk about the political climate in Romania, because I want to talk about the conception of the character of Alma, where she does have these westernized ideals attached to her, which kind of goes against communist values. But I also want to talk about the cultural and political climate in Romania when this was made, because this is 5 years before the Velvet Revolution, which was notable because it was non-violent, whereas in Romania, the revolution there in 1989 was extremely violent. And the leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, was executed by firing squad. So I want to talk about that, I think, mainly because it gives you a bit more appreciation for the environment that they were working in, the constraints that they had placed on them. Ceausescu came to power in the mid-60s and was originally seen as something of a libertarian. For example, he came out and he condemned the Prague Spring invasion by Russia. And because of the Warsaw Pact and the agreements made there, Romania, although within that Soviet bloc, within communism, had a slightly more independence than a lot of the other states, which I mentioned earlier. Ceausescu gets into power, and so we see a bit more permissiveness in media and the arts. So Kazan talked about how he was able to see Hanna-Barbera as a kid, how he was able to see Disney. It was shown on TV, it was shown at the cinema. His early experiences of film with things like Charlie Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy. So they did have a westernized cinema, westernized media access, which they didn't get in Russia. They didn't get in Czechoslovakia. But into the 70s, Ceausescu started to become something of an autocrat. He developed his own form of the KGB. Everything was under mass surveillance. There was this a period of fear, of suspicion, of paranoia, of danger. And everything was locked down to this one man's iron rule. And within that, things like national values were promoted. So it was very similar to the Soviet system. By the end of the 70s, the leader had racked up a lot of debt. They were in so much foreign debt and really struggling. And so he had to orchestrate an economic policy, which meant that Romania started to to export most of its produce to try and pay back these debts. And so by the early 80s, the country was living under really harsh austerity. And everything is still state funded. So Anima were part of the state funding. They had their own state funded record label. And I bring this up now because it's relevant for something I'm about to talk about. But everything was state controlled, state owned, and heavily censored. And so it's quite remarkable that they managed to piece together like a jigsaw one of the first feature-length animated films in Romanian sci-fi on very scant budgets as part of this kind of fractured team, and yet it comes together, and so we can see it now. And I think it gives you a much more appreciation when you think of the fact that the animators, the artists were working on a pittance. There just wasn't any money. There wasn't any money for anything. Everything was about make do. And, so much commitment that goes into that, so much passion to bring something like this around. Making a traditional animated film is just really backbreaking work as it is, but they're working without the technologies that America have, without the budgets, without anything, so it's kind of remarkable. I bring up the Soviet aspect and the nationalist aspect because I wanted to draw attention to Alma, who's about to come back in a minute as we get to the climax. There was a paper written by Natalie Kononenko, which was... She's a professor of Ukrainian folklore. And this was published in the Journal of American Folklore in 2011. It was issue 127, where she wrote this article called The Politics of Innocence, Soviet and Post-Soviet Animation on Folklore Topics, which is a really absorbing, fascinating article that talks about how the Russians in the Soviet Union would use animation as a tool for propaganda, for promoting national values, and packed it full of ideology. And I just want to read a little quote from this. She says, Disney did not have the monopoly on using animated folklore films for marketing purposes. During the heyday of Soviet animation in the 70s and 80s, cartoons that seemed to follow folk tales were altered slightly to convey messages in keeping with Soviet ideology. They not only criticized capitalism, but also depicted women as sexless and self-sacrificing, and urged cooperation, neighborliness, and non-violence. And as we see with Alma, and look at this model, Alma is, as I've already covered, distinctly sexualized. To go back to that reference to heavy metal, she wouldn't look out of place in something like in heavy metal, on an album of talking the genre of music, heavy metal album cover. She wouldn't look out of place in that world. And there is a definite westernization to that character conception. And again, I think this comes from Kazan. He in his interview, which you'll see on this disc, he doesn't claim full credit for anything because it was a very collaborative process. And he says he doesn't remember specifically who came up with what, but he does think that he had something to do with the conception of Alma. But she is a sexualized being, and she has huge breasts. In the article by Kononenko, for example, she uses the Tex Avery cartoons, the very sexualized women in that as the American model, and compares and contrasts them to Russian animation from the same period. But this idea of the sexless woman under communism, there was no gender in that respect. In a way, traditional gender rules were broken because everyone was a comrade. But within that, women were portrayed as rather sexless. I think the Czechoslovaks got away with a lot more because within the fairy tale, you'd often see films emerging within the 70s after the Prague Spring that could be read as proto-feminist. So things like The Little Mermaid, Valerie in A Week of Wonders, the Czech version of Beauty and the Beast, the Czech version of Cinderella, Three Nuts for Cinderella, in that you've got a tomboy Cinderella in that one. So there was some sort of room for maneuver. But with this one, you know, it does seem to relate to a very specific Western way of portraying women. And it gives this an edge, I think. It gives the film a real edge, a kind of sexual tinge. I think I'd be remiss, even though I'm not going to say this was influenced by it, but Demon Seed, which was a film that came out after 2001, obviously influenced by 2001, more of the horror genre, which was, that was 1977, directed by Donald Cammell, in that you have an AI in that kidnaps, called Proteus. He takes over and kidnaps this woman played by Julie Christie and tries to inseminate her with a seed. So that's like the more adult version of Delta Space Mission, you know, because we're not quite sure. With the super brain, I guess he's just obsessed with this idea that she calls him beautiful, like she notices him, and it awakens this huge ego, this massive ego. All geniuses without heart is ego, I think, is the central message in this. I wanted to pick up on the character of Alma because I do find her, she is just striking and really, really incredible. Before we get to the end, because there isn't much time left now, but I did want to quickly discuss the soundtrack to this. The existing soundtrack that we have is fun. It has like a really sort of disco-y, upbeat edge to it, especially that main theme. But it wasn't the original. It wasn't the original soundtrack to this. There was actually a soundtrack recorded by an artist called Rodion G.A., who was like very subversive. He was like a bit of a pioneer in Romania and very, very experimental. He founded this sort of experimental, progressive electronic band in the 70s, did manage to release some singles on the state label, but kind of disappeared without a trace. And again, I believe that the soundtrack to this had came from a process of competition. And so Rodion G.A. recorded his version of the soundtrack, which you can now hear. This was released in 2014 by Strut Records. So you can actually stream this now, and it was commissioned and then never used for whatever reason. He basically recorded like a 15-minute prototype score, and then it was dropped. So finally in 2014, this was unleashed, still quite obscure. Not many people really. Rodion G.A. was like quite a cult figure in Romanian culture, and he was quite well known as well. And yet, for whatever reason, he was considered kind of dangerous, though. In a Guardian article, for example, Rodion G.A., the lost musical superstar of Ceausescu's Romania, talks about how, in an interview with him from 2018, he says, Romania was a village country. You know what I mean? There were a lot of peasants living in villages who were working in the security and the politia, and they didn't like the students, and the people were following fashions like long hair. And also they were very angry against the people in the cities, and they only liked folk music. And they were very, very angry against the people who were listening to other kinds of music. A lot of parents made the mistake of cutting the hair of their sons when they were sleeping, a big trauma for young people. And this was a reason for lots of crime made by children against their parents. And this was a fact. They made a very big mistake cutting the hair of some people. There were people who committed suicide. So he started as a record collector, and then he became like Romania's first one-man band, as the article describes him. Made this amazing psychedelic music. And like he said, because there just was no equipment, there was no music, so he had to like improvise with everything. He said in the interview, "There is no loudspeaker in the world that I cannot repair. I made coils, I made cones from paper and replacement parts." And he used a Tesla 2-track reel-to-reel for recording. He started recording his songs in 1975 and said, "A lot of people said I'm mad, and from a madman came mad music." So he would have done the score. And I think it's really interesting that you can hear that score because it's so dissonant compared to the one that we have now. I love both scores, but I think it's important to end on that note because, you know, it's like this alternate universe, this strange thing that was later uncovered that was thought to be lost. And so all that leaves me to say, if you've stayed with me until the end, we didn't really have a lot of time here, but if you stayed with me until the end, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this commentary.
If you're looking for more horror outside of the mainstream, look no further than Unsung Horrors, a podcast about underseen horror movies. I'm Lance.
And I'm Erica. Every other week, we'll cover a horror movie with fewer than 1,000 views on Letterboxd. We'll even give you double feature recommendations to pair with the movies we discuss.
From gothic to shot on video, from slashers to comedies, from giallo to J-horror. We'll cover all the subgenres. So join us as we unearth these hidden gems of horror.
Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, all at Unsung Horrors, available wherever you listen to podcasts. And part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description